glands, which are just above your kidneys. And what happens then, it releases cortisol, which then washes over the body and the brain. So let's have a look at what the long-term effects are for that cortisol release. So as I said initially, what happens when you panic or you get scared is you release a surge of the stress hormone. And what that does is actually it shuts down your whole system. So it stops you thinking, it stops your immune system from working, and generally gets you ready for the fight or flight. So you're either going to run or you're going to fight. So if cortisol is continually produced in your brain and it's left unchecked, it can flood it. And the result of that is that it can damage neurons in your brain because it's quite toxic. Now, the result of that is that it can cause long-term damage to the limbic system or the orbital frontal brain. So if you think of the brain as being like a circuit board and it's firing off neurons all the time, which help you eventually put down memories about how to do things. And those memories are formed in the limbic system, which is central to the emotional literacy and to self-regulation. So, for example, how to do things and how to help regulate your bodily functions. So if that limbic system is awash with the toxic hormone of cortisol, then what that then does is it impacts all of those areas: emotional literacy, memory, and self-regulation. So the child's brain actually develops from birth onwards. In fact, 90% of the child's brain is developing from birth onwards. And while that's developing, the connections between the neurons are created. Now, what happens as the child is growing up and it's being cared for by the parents and it's developing emotionally, it's having a number of intersubjective experiences that are helping it to form memories. And one of those memories is about how to emotionally regulate. And that develops through a constant, attuned and healthy emotional supportive other who help to ensure that the child develops the ability to self-regulate and keep cortisol levels in check. So, for example, when we're born in the early months of our life, we produce cortisol twice a day, around sort of 10 o'clock in the morning and around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And those of us who have babies will know those are the times when our babies are most likely to be crotchety. Now, what do we do with a baby that's crotchety? We hold them, we contain them, we jiggle them up and down. And what that's doing to the infant's brain is telling that infant it's okay, you can stop producing the cortisol, and the infant then starts producing hormones that stop them from feeling stressed. So that interaction from the mother or the carer and the child is really important because it's helping the child to lay down memories of what happens when they get stressed. Now, eventually, as the child gets older, they're able to regulate themselves. Now, if a child does not get that intersubjective emotional relatedness, the toxic levels of stress hormone are consistently released and the attachment deficits can occur. So, what might we observe in the therapy room with a client that's had this experience as a child of having high levels of stress? Well, what we might see is that they are hypervigilant, because if that stress hormone isn't turned off, the hypothalamus in the brain consistently keeps telling the brain to keep passing messages to the adrenal glands to keep producing the hormone. What happens then is the toxins keep on being released and it actually doesn't get turned off. So what happens is the client then becomes hypervigilant. And what they are more likely to become as they get older is highly anxious and not so readily able to self-regulate. So it will only take one thing to tip them into high levels of stress. So, for example, in our everyday lives, we can normally manage 2, 3, 4, 5 difficult things a day, and we're able to regulate ourselves. For those people who are hypervigilant, they can only manage one thing, and it only takes a second thing to tip them straight into high stress anxiety levels. So what they might do to be able to cope with that is they may disassociate from those high stress levels. So go off in their head somewhere and switch out. They may go into capacitation. Rather than being in the world, they'll incapacitate and not do anything about problem solving. Or they just might stay in the high levels of anxiety. What they will have is a poor ability to self-regulate. What they might do as well, if they haven't received that intersubjective experience, is discount what they can do for themselves, or discount the high level of problem that they might have, and discount they can solve it. They will consistently be fearful when they go into that stressful state, and as I said, they'll be hypervigilant, and they also may experience a lack of trust. And it's likely too that they'll have a poor attachment ability.
Equipped to deal appropriately with anxiety. Let me highlight the key areas of your brain that are involved, and then I will explain what happens inside the brain. The thalamus is the central hub for sights and sounds. The thalamus breaks down incoming visual cues by size, shape and colour, and auditory cues by volume and dissonance, and then signals the cortex. The cortex then gives raw sights and sounds meaning, enabling you to be conscious of what you are seeing and hearing. And I'll mention here that the prefrontal cortex is vital to turning off the anxiety response once the threat has passed. The amygdala is the emotional core of the brain, whose primary role is to trigger the fear response. Information passing through the amygdala is associated with an emotional significance. The bed nucleus of the stria terminals is particularly interesting when we discuss anxiety. While the amygdala sets off an immediate burst of fear, the BRST perpetuates the fear response, causing longer-term unease typical of anxiety. The locus coeruleus receives signals from the amygdala and initiates the classic anxiety response: rapid heartbeat, increased blood pressure, sweating, and pupil dilation. The hippocampus is your memory center, storing raw information from the senses, along with emotional baggage attached to the data by the amygdala. Now we know these key parts, what happens when we are anxious, stressed, or fearful? Anxiety, stress, and of course fear are triggered primarily through your senses. Sight and sound are first processed by the thalamus, filtering incoming cues and sent directly to the amygdala or to the cortex. Smell and touch go directly to the amygdala, bypassing the thalamus altogether. This is why smells often evoke very powerful memories or feelings. Any cues from your incoming senses that are associated with a threat in the amygdala, whether that threat is real or not, current or not, are immediately processed to trigger the fear response. This is the expressway. It happens before you consciously feel the fear. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland cause the adrenal glands to pump out high levels of the stress hormone cortisol. Too much cortisol short-circuits the cells of the hippocampus, making it difficult to organize the memory of a trauma or a stressful experience. Memories lose context and become fragmented. The body's sympathetic nervous system shifts into overdrive, causing the heart to beat faster, blood pressure to rise, and lungs to hyperventilate. Perspiration increases and the skin's nerve endings tingle, causing goosebumps. Your senses become hyper-alert, freezing you momentarily as you drink in every detail. Adrenaline floods to the muscles, preparing you to fight or run away. The brain shifts focus from digestion to focus on the potential dangers, sometimes causing evacuation of the digestive tract through urination, defecation, or vomiting. Heck, if you're about to be eaten as someone else's dinner, why bother digesting your own? Only after the fear response has been activated does the conscious mind kick in. Some sensory information takes a more thoughtful route, from the thalamus to the cortex. The cortex decides whether the sensory information warrants a fear response. If the fear is a genuine threat in space and time, the cortex signals the amygdala to continue being on alert. Fear is a good, useful response essential to survival. However, anxiety is a fear of something that cannot be located in space and time. Most often, it is that indefinable something triggered initially by something real that you sense, but that in itself is not threatening, but it is associated with a fearful memory. And the bed nucleus of the stria terminals perpetuate that fear response. Anxiety is a real fear response for the individual feeling anxious, and anxiety can be debilitating for the sufferer. Now that you know how anxiety happens in your brain, we can pay attention to how we can deliberately use our prefrontal cortex to turn off an inappropriate anxiety response once a threat is